Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everybody else that did service as well. It's good to be back. Good to see some faces who continue to come back and clearly haven't got bored with my laments yet. I say yet. It's only a matter of time. Well, who knows? I think last week I spent more time on the recap and more time on the lament than I intended to, and covered very, very little of tradition two, but I'm not overly concerned. It was always going to be a two-weeker anyway. It's just one of those traditions that just has so much material attached to it. And I guess in theory we could wrap in all the 12 concepts, which tradition two is, I suppose, the funnel that runs into them, and we could talk about this from weeks on end, and nobody wants to do that either, and at least not at this stage. But I think it's important that it do a bit of a recap, and I want to continue to set the tone. And it's interesting, Chris. Every time you read the introduction, I pick up something different from it, and even the very idea that the group conscience at Belfast Recover Group has decided to have a workshop on the traditions. It's, as you're reading that, I kind of thought, right, how odd that we had to have a group conscious business meeting to decide to do something that we used to do all the time. Like what happened to us? Like, where did we find ourselves in a position where we weren't talking on a regular basis about this very, very important set of codified instructions that hold all of this together? Why did we as a group stop talking about it publicly? I suppose it was the first thought that came to mind. And I guess I just see all these parallels. Is everything that happens in AA the same? You see the parallels in terms of the way the service structure runs in a group compared to, the service structure and conference is all quite the same. But also, I kind of see like the sets of behaviors seem to be quite similar. And normally what we do is we go through the whole the part in the forwards of the second edition. Well, I like to go through that in this workshop, and I'm just going to summarize it really, really quickly because, like I say, I waffled on a bit too long last time. But, it tells that story of a bunch of lads got together, figured out a bit of a coding system, that went on to be called the 12 steps. They figured that out through trial and error, put a book together, things started to pick up. Next thing, they started getting, press and media attention, and then, this massive article goes into the Saturday Evening Post, and then boom, this incredibly wonderful thing happens. AA becomes this national institution practically overnight. Isn't that a nice thing? No, I suppose is the plain and simple answer to that. If you look at it from a certain angle, and that is that level of growth isn't necessarily beneficial to any organization whose value system needs to be held together. So I give the example, I think it's in the first or the second week, that I had a McDonald's in Hong Kong once. I also had a McDonald's in Lurgan in County Armagh once. And I use those two because I can't think of any two places more culturally separated. And I mean, no disrespect to either place, they're both wonderful, but they're very different places. Now, the product that I bought was more or less the same price and was more or less the same product. So that was a system that was franchised so effectively that what you had was consistency. Now, I'm not debating whether McDonald's is a good product or not. That's not for me to discuss. I am talking about the consistency within that, though. Whenever I walk into a place with the golden arches, I know more or less what I'm going to get. Well, McDonald's are in the providing of relatively unhealthy food snacks for people business. I, on the other hand, am in the saving of lives business. So whose job's more important, mine or theirs? Mine is a simple answer. And not just me. Anyone who has worked through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and commits themselves to the 3 legacies of Alcoholics Anonymous is therefore a leader. And if you look at the stuff that we talked about again in week 1 within concept 9, that goes on to talk about that. And I might just read it again because it's just so powerful, because I'm just so bored with all the sort of namby-pamby running away from responsibility stuff. It says here this is true, particularly in the area of 12-step work, in which nearly all of us are actively engaged. Every sponsor is necessarily a leader. The stakes are about as big as they can be. A human life and usually the happiness of a whole family hang in the balance. What a sponsor does and says, how well he estimates his reactions of his prospects, how well he times and makes his presentation, how well he handles criticisms, and how well he leads his prospects on by personal spiritual example. These qualities of leadership can make all the difference, often the difference between life and death. So I'm responsible for somebody's life. And if I turn up at an AA meeting or one of these meetings that has the AA logo, but maybe God knows what it is whenever you walk in, I'm responsible for what I say. I prefer the other version because it's easier, because I'm lazy. Where it's like, it's not really my responsibility, God gets people sober. What we do, we just turn up and do our best. Like, what a load of crap. What a ridiculous cop-out whenever our job is to take responsibility for the lives of others. Can we talk about this? Is it okay for me to say that? Is it okay to say that this is an absolute mess, that we've allowed this to slip so far away from the original intention? That the responsibility, I'm not saying that I get people sober, but what I'm saying is I'm responsible for my behavior within the process. That's not my opinion. That's what it says in AA literature. But getting back to what it says in the foreword to the second edition, whenever this boom happened, whenever this massive increase within numbers happened, there was inconsistencies. You would find that you would head up to Cleveland and there's a bunch of guys up there and maybe they're using the Bible or whatever. Not that there's anything wrong with that particular publication, but it was inconsistent with maybe what the guys are doing in New York. And the reaction to that was, oh man, we got to do something about this. Like they were worried about it. Can we all meet together? Will there be schisms? Will there be quarrels? Will it be over money? Like, well, where would, and they weren't just random questions. They were questions they already knew the answers to because those problems were happening. But they all started running. They had like a blue light reaction to it, where they actually cared so much about our fellowship and cared so much about the newcomer. And which newcomer do you mean? Do we mean me? Well, I haven't been here very long, so maybe that's who we're talking about. Well, no, I don't think so, because if AA passes off the scene tomorrow, I'm fine. I'm 100% fine. Chris, do you see if I need to make a 10-step call? I'm sure you'll take it. My friend Joe's taken about 1,000 of them from me over the years. There's loads of people who I can phone. I don't need AA. I don't need AA to be there for me. But what about the child whose parents haven't met yet, in order to conceive him and her, for him later to find out down the line that his life's fallen apart, and whenever he takes alcohol into his system in whatever form, something happens in the bodily and mental sense that makes it virtually impossible for him to stop. And he's gone to everywhere and spoke to the PhDs and there's nobody there to help. Where's he going to go? Well, you would think he would go to the same place that I went. And I guess what I'm saying is, I hope not. Because the place that I went was shit. It may well have had the AA branding over it, but there was not AA on offer. And I said something last week, and one of my fellows in AA kind of pulled me up on it, so I thought I would talk about it because I think it was interesting. And what he said, what I had said was, we kind of take this attitude of, well, the groups who call themselves AA, who don't do AA, are doing the best they can. And God love them. And what I was saying is, no, they're not. And I firmly believe that because, I wasn't sent on the AA Traditions Advanced Learning course that you pay 50 quid for and a tutor comes and teaches you, because that doesn't exist. There's just a series of books that you read. And then you go through these books and you maybe speak to someone with experience on them and they help you to understand the context and around them. And then that's how the traditions are applied to Alcoholics Anonymous. Like, I was part of a small group of people who started a group and knew that, well, we can't just, buy a coffee pot and, persuade a church hall manager to give us access to their premises. We're in the saving of lives business. So if we're in that business, we have the responsibility to learn what is required in order to do this right. So if we knew that with access to the same material as everyone else, why doesn't everyone else know that? Now, certainly I can see the argument that perhaps there was a time if you were in the middle of nowhere and deepest, darkest Donegal up a mountain or whatever, and you arrive in an AA group and there's an old timer there who says, yeah, I'm the boss of AA and what I say goes or whatever, and you've no context to see anything other than that, you're well within your rights to believe that. But I'm not convinced that that's how we consume Alcoholics Anonymous anymore. I don't think we find ourselves in out of context situations where we can't cross-reference that information. I know that I consume AA through speaker meetings that I can now find on Spotify and various other podcast platforms. You know, I consume AA using this online medium. If I arrive in an AA group in its physical form and I'm concerned about the quality of the message, I've got other places where I can find out. You know, I don't have to look at the traditions on the wall and think, I wonder they're a mystery for the elite. I can find out. You know, is it okay that we find out? Is it okay that we say that we have a responsibility to find out? Is it okay that we maybe talk about we have a pledge that sort of tells us what our responsibilities are? Is it okay that we maybe just call bullshit on a lot of this stuff? I don't know. I guess I think so. And, whenever the group asks me to do this particular workshop, I was very, very pleased and honored to be of service to the group. But I responded saying, well, if you want me to do it, I'm going to have to do it from where I'm at the moment. And I have to tell you the truth. And this is from someone who was part of a group of 4 people who started a group. One since has died. Took his own life because alcoholism got the better of him. And then there was 3 of us, trying to make this work in a world where Alcoholics Anonymous in Ireland decided they didn't want people like us. And what sort of people are they? People who sit there with highlighters with their big book going through it. Maybe we don't want people like that in AA. Maybe we don't want people who say that sponsorship's really important. The idea of offering sponsorship was frowned upon and it was mentioned in meetings at this crazy groups that actually offering people sponsorship. We don't do that. It's not awful. At one point I thought I was going to go home and find an upside down cross burning in the front of my house because Alcoholics Anonymous didn't want me to be part of it because we were saying to people, do you know what? This is how I got sober. And if you're willing to go to any lengths to get what I have, which is like complete freedom, I can help you with that. So the thing that was calling itself Alcoholics Anonymous was apostate to Alcoholics Anonymous. So forgive me if I don't give a fuck if you think that I should say this or not, because that's what I'm saying, because that's what happened. But getting back to the part in the script that sort of baffled me, Chris, was, this kind of a boom thing where there's a boom that happens and then things get maybe diluted and whatever. And the guys decided to codify and put together traditions. I've been over this a few times. I'm not going to bore you with it. But it just sort of occurred to me that kind of must have happened to us as well. Because whenever we were nerding it out at the back of our church hall with our little highlighters and whatever, we were also not particularly effective because nobody came to visit us, because, I don't know, I guess they thought we were pretentious or something, and perhaps they were right. Maybe that's something we had to learn. But then there was a big fancy cold came over from China, and we were told to shut down our meetings in the form that they were in, and we were told that we have to go on to online meetings, which I thought would be crap. Nonetheless, we sprung these online meetings up, and then all of a sudden, we were just deluged with folks who wanted to get sober. It was this kind of, whenever I was like sponsoring people, and they're saying, my goodness, I find it really hard to find somebody to sponsor, and they weren't saying that anymore. They were stacked up in pallets. And I remember we had to work out a way of going through the last few chapters, maybe in a group, to try and speed things up because we were outnumbered, and we're contacting some of our friends in London and down in Dublin and a colleague in Athlone and saying, can you guys help out? There was this massive deluge of folks coming in wanting to get sober, and that's where we devoted our time, Chris, and I believe that was the right thing to do, and I believe that you were one of the beneficiaries of that approach, so I'm sure you would also agree. But nonetheless, we stopped talking about the tradition, so I'm so glad that we're now starting to do that again. All right, that's the end of my lament. I'm going to get down to business now because last week I covered very little because I was in a ranty mood, and it's done now. I've said what I needed to say. I think the tone has been set. All right, tradition one. Tradition one is about unity. Let's just bring up this wee graphic real quick because I think it's important. Or is it? Okay, one day I'll get good at this. Okay, it's this wee graphic where we have the traditions laid out like this. Right, all color coded. We're going to go through them in sections. And what we started off with was the dark blue section, tradition 1 and tradition 12. We've chosen to speak of those together because there's a bit of a seesaw effect that we're going to keep coming back to as we go through. So first of all, why? What's the purpose of the 12 traditions? The purpose of the 12 traditions is unity. How do we unify? And this term unity, I think, is often misunderstood as meaning that I need to agree with what you say and you need to agree with what I say. And if we're sitting in a group conscience business meeting and Chris says something I don't agree with, I think, oh, well, I better not disrupt unity by saying, well, hang on, I might have a different view, whatever. It doesn't mean that. It means that there's something around which we unify. And the example that I love to give, the National Association of Stamp Collectors, which may or may not exist, I have no idea if it does. If you arrived at one of their meetings and said, anybody mind if I come in here and talk about collecting stamps? What do you think they're going to say? Probably, what the hell else do you think we do here? The clue's in the name. So you would imagine in Alcoholics Anonymous, you ought to be talking about Alcoholics Anonymous. We refer to page 17 in the book that talks about this common peril that we all share, but that in and of itself would never have held us together, because what really holds us together is this common solution around which we unify. I stand shoulder to shoulder with people who are carrying the good news, the great news from this book, the book Alcoholics Anonymous, and that is what we unify around. How do we unify around that? Tradition 12 asks the question of how. So the purpose, unity, the method, anonymity. And that doesn't mean withholding your name. You'll see that my full name's on the screen. And we'll talk about the privacy element of the term anonymity once we get to tradition 11. But in this point, what we're talking about is the spiritual principle of anonymity, which is the placing of principles before personalities. So those of you who know me and those of you who have got to know me over the last few weeks will know that I have absolutely no difficulty whatsoever making my point. And I actually believe that I have some ideas that are better than Alcoholics Anonymous ideas. I'm certain of it, in fact, because that's the kind of arrogant twat that I can be at times. But the purpose of the traditions is to protect you from me. There's many other purposes, but that's certainly one of them. And the placing of principles before personalities is an incredible tool for us to unify, because if I think I'm going to turn up at our meeting on Monday morning at 6:30 a.m., please come along, folks. It's a really good meeting. But if I decide I'm going to go along there and talk about, let me think, a book by a very influential German spiritualist who likes to stay in the present moment, instead of talking about Alcoholics Anonymous, that's not for to say there's anything wrong with that particular publication. Or maybe I prefer the Quran because that's something I'm studying at the moment and I want to talk about that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that particular publication either. But the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous would have me talk about the 12 steps. And whenever we say principles, we're not talking in a general sense principles. It's not like, well, my principles as a working class man, for example, whatever. We're talking specifically about the 36 principles of Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay, so what are they? Well, it's really straightforward. And again, just to recap, I'll go through this really quickly. Within the 3 legacies of Alcoholics Anonymous, the unity principles are the 12 traditions, which we're going to talk more about. The service principles are the 12 concepts for world service, and recovery, of course, are the 12 steps. So whenever I find myself actively involved in a group conscious business meeting, I want to be saying things like, well, the big book says, so therefore I suggest, or in accordance with tradition 7, we should do the money, whatever way, trying to tether what it is that I'm suggesting to the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous, because I'm placing the consistency that comes from that. in front of my own ideas. So rather than saying things like, all right, well, I run a business and in my business we would do it that way, who cares? Unless that's relevant to the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that is how we unify. So as we go through the rest of the traditions, so 2 to 11, we're going to, at the end of discussing that tradition, we're going to say, and this is how we unify by using tradition 12, anonymity, in relation to this one particular principle. I hope that makes sense, because I only spend about 10 minutes going through all that, and I've waffled through it quite quickly. So this make a start into tradition 2 that we touched on last week. And I guess we'll read it out. In tradition 2, the first thing that stands out is the long form is shorter than the short form. Only in Alcoholics Anonymous. Don't ask me why, I have no idea. But I'll read them both. The short form, which is longer, for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants. They do not govern. The long form, our AA experience has taught us that for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. All right, let me just read you something from AA literature, just to get things moving. And I picked this out because I can identify with this as a founder of a group. And some of the challenges that I had and some of the challenges the group had because I am how I am. And I guess, well, look, I'll read it out. I'm reading from the 12 Steps and the 12 Traditions book, one that I very, very rarely refer to, but nonetheless, I think this is quite useful. I have the softback version, which I think is a different page number to the hardback, and I'm on page 137. So it says, John Doe, a good AA, moves, let us say, to Middletown, USA. Alone now, he reflects that he may not be able to stay sober or even alive unless he passes on to the other alcoholics what was freely given him. He feels a spiritual and ethical compulsion because hundreds may be suffering within reach of his help. Then, too, he misses his home group. He needs other alcoholics as much as they need him. He visits preachers, doctors, editors, policemen, and bartenders with the result that Middleton now has a group, and he is the founder. Good old John Doe, eh? Being the founder, he is, at first, the boss. Who else could be? Very soon, though, he assumed authority to run everything. His assumed authority to run everything begins to be shared with the first alcoholics he has helped. At this moment, the benign dictator, becomes the chairman of a committee composed of his friends. So he's the founder, so he's the boss. Quite rightly so. That's just the way it goes. And then a few more people come along, and then there's a committee. He's maybe not the boss, but he's the chairman and maybe feels a bit boss-like. These are the growing group's hierarchy of service, self-appointed, of course, because there is no other way. In a matter of months, AA booms in Middletown because they're actively carrying the message. I guess they're doing what AA groups are meant to do. People come in saying, oh man, I can't stop drinking. We go, amazing, we can help you with that. There's a sponsor in a big book. They work through the damn thing. At the end of it, they become sober. And then people come to them, do the same thing, and it just keeps happening. And people, keep getting sober. It's very straightforward. That's what happened in this mythical town of Middletown, USA. The founder and his friends channel spirituality to newcomers, hire halls, make hospital arrangements, and entreat their wives to brew gallons of coffee. Being on the human side, the founder and his friends may bask a little in glory. They say to one another, perhaps it would be a good idea if we continue to keep a firm hand in AA in this town. After all, we are experienced. Besides, look at all the good we've done, these drunks. They should be grateful. True founders and their friends are sometimes wiser and more humble than this, but more often at this stage, they are not. I'm not saying that I identify with this and I behaved in such a fashion at any point in the story of this group, but our group members may see that differently. Growing pains now beset the group. Scroungers scrounge, lonely hearts pine, problems descend like an avalanche. Still more important, murmurs are heard in the body politic, which swell into a loud cry, do these old-timers think they can run this group forever? Let's have an election. The founder and his friends are hurt and depressed. They rush from crisis to crisis, from member to member, pleading, but it's no use, the revolution is on. The group conscience is about to take over. Now comes the election. If the founder and his friends have served well, they may, to their surprise, be reinstated for a time. If, however, they have heavily resisted the rising tide of democracy, they may be summarily beached. In either case, the group now has a so-called rotating committee, very sharply limited in its authority. In no sense whatever can its members govern or direct the group. They are servants. Theirs is the sometimes thankless privilege of doing the group's chores. Headed by the chairman, they look after public relations and arrange meetings. Their treasurer, strict accountability, takes money from the hat that is passed, banks it, pays the rent and other bills, and makes regular reports at business meetings. The secretary sees that the literature's on the table, looks after the phone answering service, answers the mail, sends out notices of meetings. Such are the simple services that enable the group to function. The committee gives no spiritual advice, judges no one's conduct, issues no orders, and so on and so on. I can read on and read on, but it really, really sort of struck to me, and I find it really humbling. Like this Belfast Recover Group is just over 7 years old, and I served as an officer and on the steering committee of the group for 6 of those years. And I can now just look back at that and think that, man, that was maybe not a great idea. And at the early stages, it kind of made sense. We were the founders of the group, we knew what we were doing. And then, of course, lockdown happened and the boom happened. And it was like, okay, we better regain control again and hold this all together. And in the last year of serving on the steering committee, they appointed me as the chairman of the steering committee again. And I was just terrible. I just had no heart in it, I had no spirit in it, no desire in it. And I can really understand why this principle of rotation is so important that it talks about within our traditions. In tradition 9, of course, but in particular in tradition 2, where we appoint leaders. Let's not shy away from the fact that we are leaders, each and every one of us. As I sit in the back benches in the group now, I still know that my job as a sponsor is to lead. The leaders that we appoint within the group, though, well, what does a group structure look like? Well, I can only speak from experience from our own group, but we took guidance from a number of different pieces of AA literature in order to set it up in the way that we believe to be the correct way to set it up, and still believe that we did a pretty good job in that respect. And we touched on it last week as well, but if you can get hold of it online, we can't seem to get it in Ireland. But the AA group pamphlet, P16, is a great tool for the application of Tradition 2. And it kind of lays out some of the roles that you see within a group. So you have the group chairman, you got the group secretary, you got the guys that do the PI and so on. And so that's the way that we appointed that. And the part that I want to talk about, first of all, is the role that the leaders have. What authority do leaders have? And I find the word authority really interesting in the context of Alcoholics Anonymous, because we work within this very, very strange reverse hierarchical system. And it's easier to explain in terms of the service structure, so maybe we'll do that. So if we have a look at what way the AA service structure is set up visually, let me just see if I can bring this up. Now, this is the structure as it relates to the service structure within Ireland. Those of you looking at the United Kingdom are saying, well, it's not areas next, it's intergroup next, and then you would have region. Ours is the same structure, we just call it something different because that's just what we do. But if you look at this like inverted triangle, this upside down triangle, it makes no sense to me whatsoever. Because I come from a corporate background where you've got the managing director in charge at the top, you've got a board of directors the next level down, and you find that this triangle is going the way that a triangle should, with the base at the bottom being the widest part and then the bit at the top being the narrow part. This is upside down. So what you have here is at the top is the groups, and I can take it one step further, and that is that the individual member who has just come in yesterday, having been hammered and still smelling of alcohol, is at the very, very top in terms of authority. That is the most important person in Alcoholics Anonymous. And then as you go down, you then have the groups, and then you have the area committee, and then you have the intergroups, and then you have the general service conference, and then there's a board of trustees beyond that. And the more responsibility you take on within Alcoholics Anonymous, the further down the service structure you go. You don't go up to intergroup, you go down to intergroup. It's becoming, it's adopting less authority as you progress through the structure. Now, how does that make sense? Well, I guess until I actually seen it in operation, it didn't make sense to me. Like Bill Wilson talks about this, he uses this term of benign anarchy. those are not terms that I particularly enjoy because, as I say, like I run a business. I don't run a business based on benign anarchy, but yet this is how this system works. So if you appoint someone into a position of responsibility, like a chairman or a treasurer or whatever, and then give them no authority, how does that work? How can we possibly keep this function in such a way that things get done? Well, it does work. First of all, these people are appointed by a well-informed group conscience, and we spent most of the last time talking about what it means to be a well-informed group conscience. The employer, if you like, for want of a better term, is a loving God who may present himself, may or may not, I suppose. Where you say may, you leave it open to may not, and the difference between may and may not is well-informed. So if we all get together and we decide that something isn't going our way and we call an emergency group conscience business meeting and 5 or 6 people turn up and they all put their little sweaty hands on and up and vote for something and then it's stamped, whatever, like that's not a well-informed group conscience. A well-informed group conscience is where people turn up, first of all, with the understanding of the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous. One of the questions that was asked last week, I think it was last week, was, if you have a group conscious business meeting and the people there don't understand the traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous, can that be well informed? Well, of course not. That's utterly ridiculous. So in the absence of the understanding of the principles, there's nowhere you can go with that. But even on the understanding that the principles are understood, you then have the responsibility to ensure that all the pertinent information is sent in advance. Chris, you served as our chairman of the group conscience last year, didn't you? Wasn't it last year? And I noticed that you always, every single time there was a meeting in advance, 7 days in advance, sent the agenda. If there was any points raised, there was the pertinent information attached to that was sent 7 days in advance so I can have a good read at it, so I can decide where I'm at, I can do my meditation on it, I can refer to AA literature, I can get myself ready so whenever I turn up, I'm turning up at a well-informed group conscience. So that was important. So thank you for doing that because that keeps us in line with that. Because then we have this entity that turns up, a loving God who may present himself. And what does that mean? Well, if you're going to ask me what God means, I'm going to tell you that that's a discipline reserved to the artists and the poets, and it's not my place to try and figure out such a riddle. But what I'm saying is, whenever I was an officer of the group, I didn't work for any individual in the group. There was something happened whenever the collective group came together in a well-informed position that generated a force to which I was accountable. That might sound a little bit woo-woo, but we are working within a spiritual fellowship where that collective voice, that collective well-informed voice was something that I served. The role of the officers or anyone who was given a position within the group, and I'm realizing how quickly the time's gone by here. I've got some literature to refer to back this up. I may well run out of time, so if you want to hold me accountable to that, please contact me afterwards, and I'll give you all my notes. But if you're appointed as, let me see, in a physical meeting, the tea and coffee maker, then the tea and coffee maker is permitted to get on and do that job. One of the first group conscience business meetings, if you can call it that I attended in a group before we started this one, there was like 20 minutes talking about what we're going to get polystyrene cups, so we get the plastic ones that we got the last time. We'll get ones a wee bit bigger. And there was talking for ages about this. It was just like this nonsense of time being spent. Whereas in a well-informed group conscience, somebody is appointed to take responsibility for that. They are trusted with that. They are a trusted servant. They're the tea and coffee guy, and they just go ahead and buy the goddamn cups. It's not the purpose of the group conscious business meeting to have these big prolonged conversations about minutiae. But equally, whenever they appoint a committee, and it could be the officers of the group, which is the way that Belfast Recovery Group started off. And then as the group got bigger, we then appointed a steering committee. And again, please refer to pamphlet P16 about the purpose of a steering committee and why one would have a steering committee. But it talks about the steering committee does what AA cannot or should not do. And I think that's really interesting terminology. So a steering committee is probably the most experienced people in the group. They're asked to sit on a committee for a number of years, and they act as a sounding board, and they also act as the ultimate servants to the group. So if there is a job needed done, the steering committee is tasked with going and doing that job. So let me give you an example. Whenever lockdown happened and all of a sudden we had to decide what we need to do, and we need to decide it by tomorrow, to call a group conscience business meeting and get a bunch of people who are emotionally attached and worried and afraid to the whole situation for to vote on something randomly and quickly would have been the wrong thing to do. So in that situation, that's something that we felt the group conscience should not do. So it fell upon the steering committee to spend the time to make the right decisions on behalf of the group, which of course they did. Now, there's checks and balances for all that. You know, if the steering committee acts outside of its authority, the fifth concept allows the group for it to intervene and put a stop to it and all the rest. But essentially, whenever you bring someone into a position as a trusted servant, they have to be allowed to get on with it. So that's what we do as a group, and we allow our trusted servants to be trusted and to act on behalf of the group. And then these decisions are made on a day-to-day basis. Thank you. These decisions are made on a day-to-day basis to do with the running of the group, and in between, whenever we have our business meetings, then perhaps that's the time whenever other larger decisions are made that require more confirmation and more time and more discussion. We also talked last week, and I think it's perfectly appropriate to expand on the fact that the amount of time that it takes to make a decision is the amount of time that it takes to make a decision. You know, I remember whenever we were trying to decide, should we open up a group in a physical form? And there was another group down the road, and friends of mine were members of that group, and they were going to their group conscious business meeting for that same evening to decide if they should open up a meeting in the physical form. And they just talked about it for 5 minutes and did a raise hand thing and counted the hands, and the decision was made and the majority vote was taken and off they went. Whereas what we did is we looked at it and said, right, well, what information do we know? What way are we now covered with insurance? What are the implications? And we spent time on it. And at the end of that, we didn't have any consistency within the group that would suggest that we as a united group had made a decision. We hadn't unified around that decision. So what did we do? We sent it to the steering committee to go and gather more information and come back again next month. What happened next month? We still weren't able to make a decision because we weren't well informed enough. We hadn't gathered enough of the pertinent information to make the right decision. So we deferred it again. Something else I don't like about Alcoholics Anonymous. I run a business. We just make decisions. We just get things done. But you know what? The business that I'm in is not the saving of lives business. The business that I'm in is not ensuring that Alcoholics Anonymous remains consistent year after year, decade after decade, town after town. So, you know, it may well be flippant and easy to say, well, we like to make decisions really quickly. Well, we don't have the right to do that. We don't have the right to flippantly make decisions on behalf of people who are not born yet. Our job, I believe, is stewards and custodians of the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous. Is to remain steadfast to them, not delusional to them. Like, there's nothing old-fashioned about these principles. Like, we figured out how to do online meetings safely. You know, we figured out how to use technology from a bunch of principles written in the 1940s. You know, what we have here works well. It works for Alcoholics Anonymous, but we need to slow down, see them as speed bumps, see them as something that allows us to act within a group. Why? The purpose is unity. The method, the place and the principles before personalities. Tradition 2 is no exception to that. Tradition 2 looks at what way we structure a group, looks at what way we handle leadership. Oh. So I'm bored too. I'm not surprised that you're yawning there, Philomena. So once you factor all of that in, it makes sense that the placing of my principles or the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous before my personality is much more important than anything I would have brought to the table as an individual. Chris, I think I got a wee bit more done this week than last week, so I'm going to give myself a big giant pat in the back. But that's it for tonight. Any questions? I'd love to hear them.